Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Slig News. These past few years have been historic. In 2020, the COVID 19 pandemic emerged. In 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. Not only have this pandemic and war had devastating effects on the social well being of millions, but they have elicited numerous negative consequences on the global economy, trade, and more. Effects we believe may never be reversed. Coupled with the extraordinary death rate, there were numerous price surges in fields such as food, natural gas, and more, along with supply chain disruptions. Our expert Stanislav Protasov will now tell you about the container crisis and disruptions to the supply chain from COVID, along with the surge in prices of transporting goods due to this ongoing war.
Thank you. The price of transporting goods via container continues to increase. When in 2020 the world went into a lockdown, the demand for goods such as medicine, office supplies, and electronics increased dramatically, and the factories couldn't keep up with the demand. Ships were said to sail half empty, and not enough goods could be produced. In addition to that, due to the pandemic, a lot of countries closed their borders, and this caused some ports to have a lot of goods stockpiled that were unable to be shipped. This caused port congestions and disruptions to the supply chain. According to the multimedia.csmp.com, after lockdown, the average cost for 40-foot container went over $15,000 on average, resulting in a very high inflation. The price for transporting goods is not the only thing that increased. For example, the supply chain was disrupted due to COVID. Lockdowns across different countries continue to slow down the flow of raw materials and finished goods, which disrupts and even sometimes temporarily stops manufacturing. Since people had to stay quarantined and maintain social distancing, productivity significantly reduced as workers couldn't go to factories to produce goods. That, combined with the increased demand for certain goods and the fear of pandemic, slowed down the manufacturing process and created disruptions for the supply chain. Another example of supply chain disruption could be seen in China. Due to the shortage of workers to manufacture goods and raw materials, a disruption in the supply chain was created. Even tech companies like Apple were affected as due to the material shortage, China couldn't produce enough phones, which affected the supply chain. However, pandemic is not the only thing that can affect the supply chain. The recent invasion of Russia on Ukraine threatens to create a major wheat export disruption. According to New York Times, Russia and Ukraine together produce over a quarter of world's wheat, feeding billions of people with products made from wheat such as bread, pasta, canned bread goods, etc. Due to the pandemic and shipping crisis, the price of food has already risen up by a lot, and combined with this, the price of wheat will increase by 80%. This will increase the demand of wheat, and other countries that grow wheat, like northern countries in North Africa or Middle East, will be forced to produce a lot more. By blocking Ukrainian wheat exports, Russia is creating a disruption in supply chain that will have a lot of negative long-term lasting effects.
Now we have our expert on gas prices, Gabriel Cruz, here to tell us more about how and why the increasing gas prices in Europe affected production prices, why this led to a surge in gas prices around the world, and how this applies to our little red dot, Singapore.
What is causing the increasing cost of gas in Europe? Well, in February of 2021, gas prices in Europe were 10 times higher than the average of the past decade. During this time in the UK, gas was traded at 38p per therm, which is a measurement of gas consumption. In the month of August, the price rose to 537p per therm. As COVID restrictions and lockdowns were lifted, economies returned to their normal state like it was before the pandemic. Due to this, energy was in need as businesses and industries required lots of energy to get their work going. This caused energy suppliers to have lots of stress. After the pandemic, restrictions and lockdown were lifted. The Russian invasion of Ukraine occurred, causing gas prices to rise once again. Due to this, European governments had to search for alternative ways to get gas as Russia supplied around 40% of gas in the EU. This caused alternative sources of gas to rise up. The European Union has stated that they will reduce their reliance on Russian gas by 15%. For example, Germany imported 55% of their gas from Russia. After the invasion, the number dropped to 35% and is planning to end their economic ties with Russia. Even though the EU wants to cut ties, there are fears that Russia may stop gas supplies due to the fact that some countries have assisted Ukraine in the invasion. The most state-owned energy provider from Russia, Gazprom, has restricted the delivery of gas to Bulgaria, Finland, Poland, Denmark, and the Netherlands.
Finally, we have our expert of economics, Isabel Pelicani, here to tell us why this crisis relates to supply and demand and how.
So, what is supply and demand, and how does it relate to this current crisis? Supply can be simply defined as the amount of goods and services available to the general public. Demand refers to the amount of people who want to buy the product or service. In terms of relating to price, supply is inversely proportional. If one increases or decreases, the other does the opposite. Demand is directly proportional to the cost. If one increases or decreases, so does the other. In order to sell products, producers must take supply and demand into account. Gas prices in the UK increased due to supply and demand. As the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in many national lockdowns, it restricted imports and exports. Along with the pandemic restrictions and the general public's lifestyle drastically changing, many companies have found it hard to keep up in supply or find more demand. Gas is a precious resource that not every country has access to. The producers' decreasing production rates, together with the consumers' increase in demand for gas, resulted in gas companies raising their gas prices. By doing so, it filters down the list of consumers to a more reasonable level in relation to the rate of production, allowing the company to fulfill their customers' orders. After the pandemic restrictions were lifted and everything could go back to the way it was, Russia engaged in war with Ukraine. Many countries in Europe do not want to support Russia's economy, so they buy their gas from other sources. Those other sources are now really high in demand, and many are not equipped to support this level of demand. Basically, they're high in demand, but low in supply. If we refer back to the intro we had about supply and demand just a bit earlier, we would realize that this would result in prices having a drastic increase.
Overall, due to these two major events occurring in the past few years, we have experienced large-scale surges in price, along with disruptions to imports and exports, and much more. Stay tuned with Slig News to find out more.